Good evening, and thank you for everyone who stayed so late. I know it's getting late, and I timed my presentation before earlier this afternoon, and I'm at 10 minutes, so I promise you I will be done in 10 minutes, and you guys can ask as many questions as you like. I will be honest, I was a little hesitant to come today, and that's because, as is obvious, I'm not from here, and I didn't want my presence to be any indication that I was trying to tell you what to think or what to do or what your position should be on the project. But I looked closely at the environmental assessment, and I felt very compelled to come. And so it's with great concern and a lot of humility that I'm here this evening, and I hope that we've all been able to provide some information for you so that you can make your own decision on how you want to proceed with this project and what you should do. And so my goal tonight is to really just give a really broad overview of what your government is required to do in this situation and what rights you have in this kind of situation. So basically, there are two events that need to occur in order for this project to go forward. One, as some people have mentioned, BNSF needs a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. And the second event is, before the Army Corps of Engineers can issue that permit, it needs to do an environmental study under a federal law called NEPA. And what is NEPA? NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. And this federal law requires agencies to study the environmental effects of all of their major federal actions. And again, here, the major federal action is the proposed permit to BNSF. Now, one needs to understand the purpose of NEPA, because if you understand the purpose of NEPA, then you understand what the government is required to do under NEPA, and you understand what rights you have under that federal law. And the purpose of NEPA is very simple. It's not to kill projects, not even bad ones. The purpose of NEPA is to provide and to facilitate informed decision makers informed decisions by your government, and it's to promote the disclosure of information to the public. It's basically to make sure that decision makers and the public have all of the information before them before the government takes any action. So for example, if a project's going to cause a lot of air pollution, the government is required to study those environmental impacts and release that information to the public. You see, NEPA recognizes that once the government takes action, sometimes there's no turning back. If there's a project that's approved that releases a lot of air pollution in the air and people breathe that, you can't take that back. If you relocate a stream and wetlands, sometimes those streams and wetlands are lost forever. And so NEPA basically tells the government, wait, slow down. Before you make a decision, study the environmental consequences and the public health consequences of that decision and make that information known to the public so we all know what we're getting into. In this case, the Army Corps was required to study the environmental consequences of the proposed Gardner IMF facility. And the idea is that if those environmental effects are studied and disclosed, everyone can make a more informed decision about whether or not the project should go forward. So then the question is, what kind of study does the Corps have to do? What kind of substantive review does it need to perform? And there's basically two kinds of studies that are relevant here. One is called the EA, which you've heard a lot of people talk about, which stands for the environmental assessment. Another kind of study is called the EIS, which is a much more comprehensive study called the environmental impact statement. In this case, as probably many of you know already from hearing the different speakers tonight, the Army Corps only performed an EA. And the reason why it only performed an EA is because it determined that there was no chance of any significant environmental or public health effects coming from this project. I have a slide that I will show you. And I was hesitant to show this slide because it has a lot of arrows, and it could make the NEPA process look really confusing, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of very helpful information in it as well. So at the very top of the slide, the first step is that the government, or in this case, the Army Corps, identifies a need for an action and develops a proposal. So here, the action or the proposal is the proposal to grant a permit to BNSF. After that, the government or the Army Corps asks itself if there are environmental effects that are likely to be significant from the project. And if the Army Corps is uncertain as to whether or not there will be environmental effects, it goes to that box 6. It's kind of in the middle of the screen. And it's supposed to do an environmental assessment, or an EA, and that's what was done here. And if the results of that EA are that there are no significant impacts, which is what the Army Corps concluded here, then the Army Corps issues what's called a FONSI, or a finding of no significant impact. And then what you'll usually find after the issuance of a FONSI is the Army Corps, the government, reaches a decision. In this case, it would likely be the issuance of the permit to BNSF. Now, if the EA had done everything that everyone up here seems to agree they should have done, which is find that there could be significant impacts, you would go up to box 8 and 9. And what the Army Corps would do is issue what's called a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement. And all that is a public notice that says, hey, we're the Army Corps, there's this big project that may go forward, and we're going to conduct this really big environmental study to determine what the environmental effects are. And shortly after that notice is issued, there is a period called the public scoping period, and that provides the public an opportunity to tell the Army Corps what the scope of environmental impacts that should be considered within the EIS. So for example, if you think there are going to be certain water quality impacts, or traffic impacts, or air quality impacts, you can tell the Army Corps that, and they will consider that in determining what the scope of the environmental or EIS should look like. After the scoping process, the Army Corps will actually draft a draft EIS, and then it will release that to the public. And the public has an opportunity to review the draft EIS and provide comments. So let's say you look at the draft EIS and you think, well, this is pretty comprehensive, but there's a few things missing here, or I think there were a few conclusions that were incorrect or improper assumptions that were made. You can again provide comments to the Army Corps. The Army Corps is required to consider those comments. Not only do they, consider them in their heads, but they actually have to respond to you. And when they respond to you within the final EIS. So the final EIS is supposed to be the time in which the Army Corps perfects its environmental analysis and responds in writing to all of the comments that it receives. Now, after the final EIS is done, it's then made available to the public, and the Army Corps has to wait at least 30 days before it can make a decision on whether or not to issue that permit. So this is just a real quick process flow chart that shows you how things would proceed if there is an EIS. The reason why I like this flow chart is because you see when you have an EIS just how many more opportunities you have as a public member to be involved in the process, to provide your input, and to really, in a lot of ways, oversee what the Army Corps is doing and the decisions that are made. Like I said, when I was first approached to come here this evening, I had some hesitancy, but when I looked at the EA, I just saw how many flaws there were within that environmental document. My background is also air pollution, and so my focus has always been on trying to look at the air quality aspects of environmental reports. And like Andrea detailed, there are just so many flaws, so many areas where the Army Corps didn't even look. And quite honestly, I didn't notice this when I first looked at the environmental document. But if you look at the appendix, well, let me put it this way. The front of the environmental document has the Army Corps' logo on it, which you would expect. And I don't know if the other appendices are like this. But when I turn to the air quality appendix to the EIR, I saw BNSF's logo on it. And I'll be honest, it's not uncommon for a project applicant to have to pay for the environmental study. I mean, quite frankly, taxpayers shouldn't be paying for those kinds of intensive reviews. But, I just wonder how much the Army Corps actually did its own independent review of this project, or alternatively, how much it was just kind of rubber stamped through. So I would really urge anyone who is concerned about this project to try to provide